In the world of One Punch Man, almost anything is possible or can exist, and God is no exception. This video will get into the entity that others like Homeless Emperor and Psykos refer to as God, as he gave them some of his vast power, but also we'll see his role in the story so far and how he's trying to entice some of the heroes such as Saitama and Tatsumaki. Before we get into God and what he can do, let's discuss this being's name. As previously mentioned, this entity is referred to as God by the mysterious beings such as the Homeless Emperor and Psykos, but he's called Yatsu by Blast, who seems familiar with God's tactics of manipulation and his cube devices. Yatsu can translate to him or guy, usually in a derogatory sense, at least according to other anime uses of the term. It's almost as if Blast calls him that guy over there, which is certainly not acknowledging him as a godly being. But what does God look like? Well, it changes throughout the story. Homeless Emperor saw him as a giant humanoid entity with rings floating around it, almost like a planet so massive it has a gravitational pull, causing items to rotate, similarly to Saturn or Jupiter. Along the same vein, Psykos described this god as having a planetary shape, but also looking like a collection of cells, and appearing similar to the planet Jupiter. Keep in mind, Psykos had a limited view of this being and not the full picture that others such as Homeless Emperor or the mural in the ancient ruins depicted. In both cases, there's a sense of familiarity as well as a reference to space and our solar system, namely the planet Jupiter, since it's both our largest planet and has rings. Interestingly, if we consider what the name Jupiter stems from, it has a relationship with the Greek god Zeus, which as we all know is the king of the gods. And Jupiter, according to the Roman gods, roughly translates to Sky Father, and that fits quite well with this god's appearance on the moon later on. Before we get deeper into this god being and what he can do, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for some plot armor today. So far, we know that this entity can grant his powers to those he deems worthy, with no clue as to the criteria he uses in order to decide that. It's not as simple as having a moral compass or not, as this god offers his powers to both the Monster Association and Hero Association members. Additionally, the powers God grants vary depending on the person who accepts them. A newfound ability, a boost to psychic abilities, and probably more we haven't been told yet. It seems to point to the fact that God can either grant powers to someone who has none, or help make the person's powers even stronger than they were previously. On the flip side, if God thinks that the person he gave his powers to is no longer worthy, he can take it back along with their life, but we'll get into that later. Aside from that, God's goal is to be resurrected on Earth, but in order to do so, he needs a worthy sacrifice. Now, this may explain why this being is seeking a worthy vessel for his power, pretending to offer something without needing anything in return, when he's actually just looking for the one that he can sacrifice in order to be revived. Then there's the matter of his mysterious cubes, which can be found almost anywhere, as shown in one of the chapter covers. These cubes are used as both a means of communication to speak to worthy people and offer them his power, but also require a warp ability similarly to Blast, who collects them. Lastly, this entity has the ability to change his forms, as will be discussed later on when he takes Blast's form. But let's get down to business now and go in a somewhat chronological order of God's appearances so far. Thankfully, we've been spoiled with the redraw of the fight between Saitama and Orochi. Without it, we wouldn't have this extra look into this god thing and an endgame goal of his. During Orochi's fight with Saitama, we're given a flashback to when Orochi was becoming too strong and needed more sustenance for his body. The monster sacrifices weren't enough anymore, so he dug deep underground to seek energy to drain from the planet itself. Through that, Orochi finds ancient ruins deep underground that none of the other monsters know about yet, and maybe never again due to it being destroyed, but that's for you to decide. The underground mural depicts an image of people with monsters above them, and Monster King Orochi at the top of what seems to be a food chain or the power structure. There's also some ancient unknown language that Orochi believes he shouldn't have been able to read, which convinces him that he must be the god that needs a worthy sacrifice in order to take over the world. Needless to say, Orochi at the top of the pyramid also encourages his theory, but keep in mind, it's still only his understanding of it. And there's also an empty receptacle beneath the mural where the sacrifice is likely meant to be placed. However, with the destruction of the ruined walls caused by the fight with Saitama, the rest of the mural is revealed, and there's one other entity above Orochi, massive and ominous. The size comparison between humans, low down on the chain, and this new being at the top is staggering. As no one knew of this mural's location and imagery besides Orochi though, this information remains a secret. Let's delve now into Tatsumaki's past. 18 years ago, when she was in a research facility, at the time, a monster was running rampant and the researchers left Tatsumaki behind, believing her to no longer be useful as a test subject. Just as she's about to be attacked by the synthetic beast, Blast appears and saves her. Interestingly, there's a cube in his hands, with a panel dedicated to that fact by focusing on it. Not only could that point to the initial reason Blast was there, to collect the cube, but maybe it was his way of interfering in the god's means of offering a dejected Tatsumaki the means of taking care of herself. Additionally, during Tatsumaki's fight with Psykos later, Psykos points out that she could be using her abilities for more than just hero work. Another thing of note is the fact that God later on had said he warned Tatsumaki about something, but it's unclear what this is referencing, even for her. Maybe the warning was related to that doctor who said to prioritize test subjects with more promise and left her to die. Because why did the synthetic beast break out exactly at that moment? The entire crisis might have all been orchestrated by God to force her to ask for more power, as hers had leveled out according to the doctor. And on the more far-fetched side, when Blast gave her the advice that stuck with her even years later about never expecting to be saved by someone else, was that really Blast? Could it have been God in disguise, as he appears later on? On the other hand, it's more likely Blast gave that advice as he knows that God creates tools to look for vulnerable monsters and humans to offer power to, and having her not rely on outside power will prevent her from being tricked by the god. But let's move forward in time. As Homeless Emperor fights with Zombie Man on the surface, while Saitama and Flashy Flash are still underground, he recounts to Zombie Man that he was just a simple salaryman who had no special powers or strength. Interestingly, Drive Knight already had data about Homeless Emperor, describing him as having divine light powers, but being otherwise normal in terms of physical abilities. A man who was granted power and not through any kinds of training or experimentation like Saitama or Zombie Man. Why did Drive Knight know this? Homeless Emperor reveals even his comrades at the Monster Association aren't aware of him being a normal human in his confrontation with King. Having lost his job, depressed and on the verge of ending his life, in order to become one with the earth, God appeared to Homeless Emperor in the form of a transparent being with circular currents flowing around him. Before this moment, Homeless Emperor had expressed a disdain for humanity and their selfishness, and his entity seemed to agree with that opinion of the world, offering him power freely. But was it really free? We'll discuss how Homeless Emperor lost that gift later on. Homeless Emperor's goal with this newly gained power is to get rid of humanity, which plagues the earth. But he's not the only one with the power to destroy humanity. Later on, Psykos begins battle above ground with Tatsumaki and overwhelms her with her powers. She says, "A great force has chosen me," and granted her power when Tatsumaki asks her where the sudden boost in power has come from. Then we're given a flashback to the moment when Psykos and Orochi were fighting over control of their fused bodies. As they grew and moved further into the sky, nearly reaching the clouds, a giant circular, cell-looking globe appeared to Psykos. The planetary figure floated above her, swirling on its surface, reminding her of both brain cells in motion and outer space. This is when she describes it as the surface of Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system. Again, the term God is used to describe this planetary entity, and Psykos believed time had stopped when she encountered it. This is interesting considering how the cube's presence underground causes time to slow down, according to Blast when he speaks to Saitama and Flashy Flash. Perhaps it can't completely stop unless the person discussing through the cube accepts it wholly. Psykos explains that when time stopped, it looked at her and she was frightened, but it filled her with an immense power that showed her what her destiny would be. Psykos, according to what the being told her, is meant to use that power to absorb everything that lives and fuse them all into a singular living creature, similarly to how the Homeless Emperor believes Earth is connected and humans are living their lives in the wrong way. Psykos wants to become the planet itself by fusing with everything in the world. This seems to be the goal of this God character, regardless of who he gives his power to, always seeking out like-minded people to complete it. As the fight between Psykos and Tatsumaki continues, Psykos begins to speak in a way that sounds unlike her words, but the words of her god. She tells Tatsumaki that she chose and her sister chose to become ridiculous heroes that laments the fact that they ignored her warning. But is it her warning? No, because this is the first time that Tatsumaki had confronted Psykos besides being underground. That's why, as previously mentioned, I believe this to be a throwback to when Tatsumaki was in her cell at the research facility, in a very low place mentally. Another interesting detail is the usage of divine, or terminology related to divinity, for the two humans who now have God's borrowed powers. For Homeless Emperor, it's his divine light powers, and Psykos warns Tatsumaki that she'll face divine punishment. As the battle between Psykos and Tatsumaki rages on, the words that Psykos uses blurs the line between her and God. For one, she threatens to kill Fubuki, and this could easily be explained by Psykos having used her enhanced abilities to sense Tatsumaki's sister and her connection to her. But considering the disgust Psykos proclaimed earlier about the sisters stupidly using their psychic abilities for hero work instead, could this be God speaking speaking through Psykos. Could God be projecting his anger through Psykos now that she has some of his power? Regardless, Psykos continues with the religious references by threatening Tatsumaki with flames of wrath. But wrath is usually only unleashed by God, and even then, only when the recipient in question did something unforgivable. Could this be a combination of God's disappointment in not having trapped Tatsumaki and Psykos' anger at having to face an opponent as strong, actually stronger, than her? We return now to the underground where Saitama and Flashy Flash are trapped. As Saitama's digging Flashy Flash out from under rubble and trying to get his sword free without breaking it, spoiler alert, they don't succeed, there's an immensely heavy block in Flashy Flash's way. Saitama obviously recovers it with one arm and nonchalantly drops it on the ground, creating a huge dent that could have crushed Manako had it landed on her. Without a doubt, this block is the same type as the cube seen in Tatsumaki's memories 18 years ago, another communication device that God uses to contact people and offer them his power. With the rubble pushed aside, a hole is revealed that Manako believes she can use to escape the heroes. But the darkness within that mysterious cavity is so thick that even her eye powers can't brighten it. And though the characters can't see inside, we are given a glimpse of what's hidden. Within that darkness is a creature, the so-called God creature, folding himself into a ball with his head curled up against its legs. The size of the hole they appeared inside compared with this massive being size is almost like having an ant standing next to an entire ocean. He's unfathomably large, but upon closer inspection, the head area is likely what Psykos described, with cells and planetary vibes to it. She had only seen a singular part of its body and thus couldn't recognize its form as a body, instead comparing it to a planet. The background of the being highlights the galactic feeling to it, with stars and tiny lights surrounding the body. But the extraterrestrial theme doesn't end there. Following this, we get an interesting chapter cover which depicts a half and half image of someone on the moon and someone under the ocean. One side has the moon in the background, and the other has a giant sea creature's eyeball completing the eye motif. In the middle of the image, both hands are about to touch the mysterious cube, pointing to the fact that this god creature has been seeking out humans in every place they go, whether it be in space, underground, or even underwater. Also, this could be my imagination, but the underwater suit seems to be from an older time, hinting at this god entity seeking out a worthy sacrifice for many decades, perhaps even centuries. At this point, God finally speaks to the heroes and says, it's unusual for three to come at once. If we consider that up to this point every human who spoke to God was for the most part alone at the time, it is unusual that they're now a group facing him. God tells them to place their hand on the box. Note here that he doesn't refer to it as a cube the way Blast does. Box would signify there's a space inside to hold something or to remove something. A cube usually just refers to a shape and a density, with no hint as to there being anything within it necessarily. God continues on, telling them that if they're deserving, they'll receive power from him, but if they aren't, they'll be collected like Homeless Emperor is later on against Zombie Man. As usual, Saitama is unaffected by threats, and gods apparently, and demands to see who's talking. Here, Flashy Flash points out that it must be telepathically speaking to them, possibly suggesting that these sisters and anyone else with psychic abilities is somehow linked to this being hiding in space. Before God can continue speaking or maybe even show itself to them, Blast appears with his warp travel. Glad that they didn't accept the deal. Blast takes the extremely heavy cube in one hand, as Saitama had, and twirls it on one finger as if it weighs nothing. Then, Blast explains that the cubes can warp space and act as communicators to speak with, meaning it's uncertain that it was telepathic speech like Flashy Flash thought. However, seeing as God's body is right beyond the space of the hole, perhaps he was using telepathic powers to speak instead of the cube that just so happened to be planted within the wall. As the focus shifts back to the fight above ground, Homeless Emperor begins to abuse his power. He makes light shows in the sky with his balls of light, launching attack after attack with no real target in sight. Platinum S points out that he knows Homeless Emperor's powers are coming from elsewhere because he's not even tired after doing all of that. Then he begins to get lazy, admitting that reducing the world to ruins is too much work for him, and convinces the monsters to a competition so they can attack S-class heroes together. This is the beginning of the end for Homeless Emperor, who's simply doing as he pleases now with no regard to his original goal, the same goal that Psykos had, of ridding the world of humans and combining them with the planet. Because Homeless Emperor is so cocky, drunk on his own power, he's taken by surprise when Zombie Man is completely healed and has him pinned down. Remember, Homeless Emperor has nothing besides his divine light attacks. His physical body is normal, unlike Zombie Man, who has trained in combat and weapon use. In spite of this weakness, this is not what causes God to turn his wrath to Homeless Emperor. As Zombie Man begins to question him about his power and whether he's working for someone else pulling strings, Homeless Emperor blurts out that God gave him his power with no hesitation. From all the way on the moon, the voice speaks and says, "Silence, I declare confiscation." Homeless Emperor stares at the moon with bulging eyes, with Zombie Man not having heard the voice or seeing the entity there. God comes from the shadows of the moon, dark side of the moon perhaps, standing on top of the surface, evidently massive to be seen from such a long distance. Or is this all happening in Homeless Emperor's mind? Well, we don't know. When suddenly, Homeless Emperor's soul or spirit is transported to a large grassy field, flowers covering the ground, and the godlike entity looming over him with neither skin nor face, but a body all the same. Long string-like cells, muscles, or perhaps unfinished skin, which is beginning to form, hang from his long limbs. This form looks much different than when God was simply cells and rings that Homeless Emperor had seen previously. Could that mean that having granted powers to both him and Psykos has already helped God revive some parts of itself without needing to sacrifice in the ruins? God continues on by saying, "Your power, your life, I'm confiscating it all." And with those words and a terrified expression on his face, Homeless Emperor dies with nothing left behind but melted flesh. Just from Homeless Emperor muttering "God" and his fear-stricken face, as well as a sudden and inexplicable gruesome death, Zombie Man correctly guesses that his powers must have come from an outside source. But why was it so important that God's power not be known to the heroes? Was it because Blast was underground and would soon catch wind of this entity's involvement? Or was it a combination of Homeless Emperor's overuse of his power along with the reveal of what its source was? Later on, when Garou is on the surface confronting the heroes and perfecting his martial arts techniques, he mentions something unexpected. We know that as a character, his goal is to become a monster and not to bully people, but he also reveals his plan to destroy the unreliable crutch known as God. But wait, is this God in the traditional real-life sense we're all familiar with? That we don't know. It's unlikely that Garou is familiar with the God monster in this world, however it's not impossible. Let us know if Garou is referring to the God we've been discussing in this video or a more general concept, similar to like a catch-all. After Tatsumaki's difficult fight with Psykos, having wrung her dry, she's left on the ground unconscious from her own wounds. At that vulnerable moment, who else but God appears to her, trying to offer her some power. Interestingly, God tries to tempt Tatsumaki by pretending to be Blast, checking on her, perhaps aware of her will to reject anyone else who offers help. But even unconscious and badly beaten, she can tell it's not Blast. As readers, we can visually tell as Blast's suit looks pristine and his hair is dark as it had been 18 years ago, which isn't how he looks now. Why would God use a past version of Blast to trick Tatsumaki? Was this super powerful being somewhere completely unaware of Blast's appearance and the amount of time that has passed? How could God, whose cubes are being collected by Blast, not know that he's aged in almost 2 decades? The real Blast worries when he arrives that he's too late, but is glad to see she drove it away. Reminder that in Japanese, Blast calls God Yatsu, that guy. In the Viz translation, they call God it. Curiously, God makes sure to leave before Blast arrived. The same thing happened when his cube was underground with Saitama and Flashy Flash. This further points to some clash between Blast and God, with God purposely avoiding any confrontation with the strongest S-rank hero. But as for why, I guess time will tell. Thanks for watching the video to the end. Until next time, keep that plumber on you. I'm KJ. Have a great day. Goodbye.